Hello, everyone that's just joining. We will get going in a few minutes. And just to let you know, we are recording this. Hang tight and we'll get started soon. Hi, everyone. My name is Steven Ziegler. I'm the Programs and Activities Coordinator at Orca Senior Center. Give us a few more minutes here to let some late joiners log on, and then we'll get started soon. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Monika Wieland from the Orca Behavior Institute, and she will be talking about the different types of orcas behavior here in the Salish Sea. So Monika, thank you for joining us, and I am happy to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. So we're very lucky here in the Salmon Islands and the Salish Sea to have two different populations of orcas. We have the fish-eating southern resident killer whales and the mammal-eating Bigg's killer whales. And really, they're facing two very different stories right now, with one population thriving and one population really struggling. And so today I want to give you a little bit of background about who these whales are, why they are in the situations that they're in today, and what we can learn about the health of the Salish Sea by comparing these two populations. So I've been watching orcas from San Juan Island for about 20 years now. I fell in love with the whales here when I was a high school student, and we came up here on a family vacation from Portland, Oregon. And I immediately knew that I love these whales. I wanted to spend my time here, and I wanted to learn everything about them that I could. And we're so lucky to have incredible shore-based and boat-based whale watching here. So these are a couple of photos of me taken close to 20 years apart. On the left there is out of off Lime Kiln State Park. You can see this was back when I was a high school senior, I believe. And members of JPOD just passing right off the rocks there. And then just a year or two ago at Reuben Tart County Park on the east side of San Juan Island with Bigg's killer whales. And over the last couple decades, as I've been watching the whales here, I've worn many different hats. I've was a research intern at the Whale Museum. I worked as a naturalist on a whale watching vessel. I helped form some of the regional naturalist networks that we have. And then most recently, I co-founded a nonprofit based here on San Juan Island called the Orca Behavior Institute, where we conduct non-invasive research studying the acoustics and behavior of both these populations of killer whales. And one of the big motivations for starting the Orca Behavior Institute was these dramatic differences that I had seen in my time here. So back when I was a high school student in the early 2000s, you could spend a couple weeks out at Lime Kiln and you would see the orcas almost every single day. You were likely to see a superpod with the entire population together. And I was here for several seasons before I ever even saw a mammal-eating Bigg's killer whale. Now things have changed really dramatically, where we see the Bigg's killer whales about 4 times as often as we see the southern residents. So understanding and documenting these changes was the motivation for some of our initial research. But before we get into too many details about that, let's kind of zoom out for a second and take a look at killer whales as a species. So killer whales and orcas both refer to the same thing, and I kind of use those terms interchangeably. And as a species, they're found in every ocean of the world. They're considered one of the most widespread mammals on the planet. And right now, they're all still considered members of the same species, or Sinus orca. But scientists have recognized that they're really more of a species complex, because everywhere that you find orcas, you find these discrete populations that have specialized to forage on whatever's available in that particular area. And they're not only geographically distinct, but really biologically and culturally distinct from other groups of orcas around the world. So through DNA analysis, they've put together this sort of genealogical history of killer whales. And these are some of the the largest and most well-known populations of orcas throughout the world. And eventually we expect that some of these will be considered separate species because they are so genetically distinct from one another that it's really kind of speciation happening in process. But what's really interesting here in the Salish Sea is that we have 2 of the most genetically distinct populations of orcas anywhere in the world, and they share the same geographic area. So it might be less surprising, for instance, to find orcas in the North Atlantic and orcas in the Pacific that are genetically distinct. But here we have 2 populations of orcas in the Pacific that are genetically distinct despite sharing the same habitat with one another. So this is just a quick look at the range of both the southern resident and the Bigg's killer whales. And you can see that they're completely overlapping. And both these populations do frequent the Salish Sea here in the inland waters of Washington and BC, but they also roam throughout the entire coast from Southeast Alaska down to at least Central California. So all these different populations of orcas are considered right now ecotypes because they haven't been designated as separate species. So when we're talking about ecotypes, what are the similarities and the differences between those? So again, here we have the resident killer whales and the Bigg's killer whales, the 2 ecotypes that frequent the Salish Sea. In terms of similarities, they're all considered the same species still, or Sinus orca, at least for now. They have that overlapping geographic range that I mentioned, and then they're all given alphanumeric designations. So we can photo identify individual whales based on their dorsal fin and saddle patch markings, which is that gray mark right behind the fin. So we have these ID catalogs of both populations. But beyond that, pretty much everything else is different, at least to some degree. So overall, they're black and white. They look fairly similar, but there are some subtle morphological differences between the 2 populations. Resident killer whales tend to be a little bit smaller. They have more rounded and also forward pointing dorsal fins. And then they also have what we call open saddle patches, where that gray marking can kind of have a check mark shape. The Bigg's killer whales tend to be a lot larger, and they have all solid saddle patches. So with a trained eye, you can tell which population you're looking at just by getting a look at the saddle patch and dorsal fin. Genetically, as I mentioned, they're different. Their diets are completely different, with residents eating fish and Bigg's killer whales eating mammals. Their acoustic repertoires are completely different. So all the vocalizations that they use to communicate are distinct from one another. Their behaviors are different. The way that they move through the habitat and their travel patterns are unique. And then their social structure as well. So how their families associate with one another. And we'll get into some of these details in the coming slides here. So looking first at the Bigg's killer whales, the marine mammal predators, and these whales for a long time were known as transient killer whales. So you may have heard that term, but really because they are now spending so much more time here in the Salish Sea, it was decided that transient wasn't really a great name for them. And so there was a movement to kind of rebrand them as the Bigg's killer whale in honor of the pioneering whale researcher, Michael Bigg, who was the first one to figure out that you could photo identify these individual whales. So as I mentioned, they eat marine mammals, and throughout their entire range, there's a wide variety of species that they consume, but about half of their diet is made up of harbor seals. And then harbor porpoise, stellar sea lions, and Dahl's porpoise are kind of the next three prey items that are most common. And then other species like Pacific white-sided dolphins, California sea lions, minke whales, and elephant seals make up a small portion of their diet. And these percentages seem to hold not only coastwide, but also when they're here in the San Juan Islands. Whoops, there we go. The southern resident killer whales, they're fish eaters, but that's almost 100% salmon. They're salmon specialists, and the majority of their diet year round is specifically Chinook salmon. So it's makes up, you know, anywhere from 70 to 95% of their diet, depending on the time of year. In the fall and winter, they do diversify to other species a little bit more, especially in the fall when they head down into Puget Sound. They're taking advantage of the chum salmon runs down there in kind of October, November, December. But these guys are fish specialists. And as we'll see, as I talk about some of the other differences between these two populations, really everything about them that's different comes back to this primary difference. And that's that what they eat is different. And everything else about their behavior and how they interact with each other and with their environment kind of stems from that core aspect of who they are, whether they eat mammals or whether they eat fish. So both populations do vocalize. They can make three main types of vocalizations: echolocation or clicks that they use to navigate and forage. They make whistles, which are a social call that's most common among most dolphins, and killer whales are the largest member of the dolphin family. But while whistles are common in other dolphin species, they're relatively rare in orcas. Their most common social communication call is what we call a discrete call, which are these stereotyped vocalizations that are about 1 to 2 seconds long. And they have anywhere from 8 for the transients up to about 25 or 30 different discrete call types for resident killer whales. And these calls have been the same for the last 50 plus years that we have recordings. And they occur in these social dialects where not only are the vocalizations different between populations of orcas, but different sub-communities of orcas have different vocalizations as well. So within the southern residents, we have 3 pods: J pod, K pod, and L pod. They all share some vocalizations among the 3 pods, but they're also acoustically distinct, where we can recognize who we're hearing just by listening in on the hydrophones. And J pod, K pod, and L pod each sound distinct as well as looking distinct. So southern residents tend to be a lot more vocal. And that, again, it relates to what they eat, because they can be very chatty and in large kind of gregarious social groups and be vocalizing with each other. And that doesn't affect their ability to hunt. But the transient or Bigg's killer whales tend to be mostly silent. And that's because they're kind of stealth predators, where they're passively listening to their environment, listening for their prey. And if they vocalized, that would alert a harbor seal or a porpoise or a sea lion to their presence, and that mammal would get out of the area and evade being hunted. So southern residents are super chatty. Transients tend to be very quiet based on what they eat. And I'll play a couple sound clips for you here just to show you really how distinct they sound. This first short clip is of the very chatty southern resident killer whales. And this is what a superpod sounds like when all three pods are together. So it really is just what it sounds like, which is a big social party among the whole population. So you hear a wide variety of different calls happening there. Transient killer whales, for whatever reason, their calls have more of an eerie quality to them. They're kind of very vibrato, and you'll recognize right away how different they sound. So this is a clip of some Bigg's killer whales. So hopefully you can tell just from even those two clips how distinct they sound acoustically from one another. So what about how they move through the environment here in the Salish Sea? This is some actual sightings data from a few observations over the course of about a week back in the summer of 2020. And southern resident killer whales, when they come into the area, they're usually coming in the Strait of Juan de Fuca out from the open ocean. And especially during the summer months, what would bring them into the area is the salmon returning to the Fraser River near Vancouver, BC. So they tend to follow, not surprisingly, the same routes that their prey take, where they come in the strait, head up to the river, and then kind of loop down and do that same circuit again. And they tend to stay to the more open waterways and are pretty predictable in their travel patterns. So that'll look something like this. They have kind of a typical figure-8 pattern that they do. They go up towards the river, they come back down, loop around the San Juan Islands, maybe head back west out the strait, but are very predictable in where they're traveling and where they can be found. By contrast, one family group of Bigg's killer whales known as the T65Bs, you can see from their travel pattern over about a similar time period that they're zigzagging all over the place. They're going into every little inlet, they're backtracking and doubling back and going every direction. They're seen in the small channels, they go into coves and marinas. And again, that has to do with what they're eating, where they'll look at all the seal haulouts and marine mammals that might be in little inlets. They'll also go into the open waters where they might find porpoises. And so they're much less predictable in their travel patterns. And again, it's related to prey, where the residents are in the big channels following the salmon runs in a pretty predictable fashion. And the Bigg's killer whales are following marine mammals, searching for marine mammals in every little channel and inlet, big or small. Now, how about the social structure between these two populations? This is a southern resident killer whale family group. These pods are matrilineal, which means that the social units in orcas tend to be made up of a mother and her offspring and her grand offspring. And for resident killer whales, those family bonds are permanent. There's no dispersal of males or females from their mother's family group. And so that's how you end up with these big groups that travel together. And a particular pod will be made up of several related females and all of their descendants. So this is a family group that we call the L4s because L4 was the oldest female in this family. And you can see these family trees that have been developed over the last 40 plus years, where she's had sons and daughters, her daughters have had daughters, and so on, sometimes up to 4 or 5 living generations at a time. And these whales will all travel together for the entire duration of their life. In the Bigg's killer whales, there's a lot of dispersal and it's very unpredictable in how it happens. So this is a similar sized family where T46 is one of the older females, and we have multiple generations of descendants underneath her. But unlike the southern residents where they all travel together, these guys are fractured into all kinds of different groups, where T46 travels with a selection of her offspring, but one of her older daughters has split off and created her own family group. And her family group has gotten so large that even one of her older daughters is now split off and is traveling by herself. And then you can see these other subgroups that as the families get larger, they split off into these smaller groups of usually 3 to 6 whales. So here's one of T46's middle daughters has split off. One of her offspring has even become a lone individual traveling by itself. And you can see that what for the southern residents would be a single group all traveling together is in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 different groups here among the Bigg's killer whales. And for a long time, we really didn't have a great grasp of this and exactly how the social dynamics of Bigg's killer whales worked. And that was because they didn't spend nearly as much time here. But now that they are here so much more, we're getting to know them to the level that we have gotten to know the southern residents over the years, where we recognize them as individuals and families and are beginning to know some of the unique histories of these populations. So just a couple quick examples from this family group. We know that the T123s actually live stranded up near Powell River in BC in 2011, where they got caught on an outgoing tide and ended up on the mud flats until the next high tide, but they were successfully refloated and went on to be, healthy and active individuals. There's this one young whale that I mentioned that's become a lone individual in 2013. This whale ended up in an inlet by itself in Canada and was eventually actually guided by DFO back out to open waters. And this whale has since taken to traveling with all kinds of different families throughout the group, including reuniting with its own mother and siblings, but also traveling with many other whales. And like other members of the population, has kind of become a lone wolf who roams on their own. And finally, in this family group is a whale you may have seen in the media a couple of years back, known as Toluque, who's a rare kind of light gray or white whale that is sometimes seen among this population. So really, this is just a couple quick examples to show that we're really beginning to understand the stories of these whales to the same level that we've been able to learn the southern residents in the previous decades. So this highlights just a few of the differences between the two populations and how they relate to one another, how they travel through the area, but what's happened in terms of their trajectories here in the Salish Sea. So this chart is going to take a look at the number of days both populations were present in inland waters here from April through September. And so along the horizontal x-axis, you'll see date and year ranging from 2005 to 2021. And then on the vertical y-axis is the number of days in that April through September time period that whales have been present in the area. And looking at southern residents, you can see they used to be here, 130-ish days every summer from April through September. Then there was a big dip in 2013, and then it kind of rebounded a little bit, but has been steadily declining since then we're down to less than 40 days in that period that they're present. So a decline of 90 to 100 days in the last 15 years in terms of how much time they're spending here. Meanwhile, the transient or Bigg's killer whale population is almost exactly the opposite. We used to see them only 30 or 40 days if you went back 15 years ago. That's been steadily increasing with a huge spike in 2017, and now is going up to even over 180 days over that time period, or almost every single day. So this is just a visual representation of that dramatic shift I talked about, where when I was a high school intern here in the early 2000s, we would see southern residents all the time. I didn't see transient killer whales for several years. And now that's completely switched, where people can come here and see those transient whales pretty regularly, which is why we don't call them transients as much anymore. And southern residents have become increasingly rare. So what's going on and why is that happening? Well, this graph again has a year on the bottom there on the x-axis and takes a look at Bigg's killer whale occurrences, which in a simple matter is basically the number of different groups that come and go from the area over time. And you can see that it follows a similar pattern to what we saw on the previous chart, looking at days of presence, where it was low, then it began increasing a little bit, and then we had a huge jump. Well, if you compare that to some of their prey populations, it's a pretty distinct correlation. This is looking at harbor porpoise in Washington's inland waters, and you can see that it follows a very similar trajectory where it was gradually increasing and then dramatically increasing. And this is the case for almost all the prey items that Bigg's killer whales feed on. We've had a resurgence of harbor porpoise, stellar sea lions, and harbor seals throughout the Salish Sea. And that started, as they received protection under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, where populations have slowly recovered and are now at or above historic levels in many cases. So it's not surprising that as we've gotten to have a lot more food here for them, we've started to have a lot more Bigg's killer whales. Now, a very similar thing, but the reverse trend has happened with the southern resident killer whales. So as I mentioned before, they're primarily salmon eaters, preferentially feeding on Chinook. And in that kind of spring, summer time period, historically, their diet was made up predominantly of Chinook salmon returning to the Fraser River. There's a long-term test fishery that happens on the Fraser called the Albion. And so this graph shows a representation of what's called a catch per unit effort. So how many fish are they catching in that test fishery near the mouth of the Fraser River based on how hard they're fishing and how often they're casting their nets there. And if you look at kind of the core summer months, here's what the data would look like for May. It was low, but now it's almost non-existent. June, bigger, but also declined. And the same things for July and for August, where we used to see these average Albion numbers that were quite high, and now they've dropped extremely low, sometimes almost hitting zero. And if we map the number of days southern residents have been present relative to that, again, it's not surprised we see this strong correlation. As the fish numbers have gone down, the southern residents have had to go elsewhere to find the food that they need. So in a lot of ways, we're really lucky that we have these two populations of orcas to directly compare to one another, because they're sharing the same habitat. So we have one habitat, two populations, and in many cases, they're exposed to a lot of the same risks. Because they're sharing the same habitat, they're exposed to the same impacts from vessels, especially if you think of things like the large tanker and freighter traffic that goes through the area. The loud noises from those ships can impact the whale's ability to navigate, to communicate, to forage successfully. Both populations are experiencing with that increase in ocean noise and other effects from vessels. Similarly, thinking about contaminants and pollutants in the water, one of the major class of chemicals that has affected both populations of whales are known as POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. And these are biomagnifying, bioaccumulating chemicals that start at kind of the planktonic level and work their way up the food chain from the small fish to the larger fish to the marine mammals. And both populations of orcas carry very high contaminant levels compared to marine mammal populations elsewhere in the world. For southern residents, they're near the top of the food chain, so contaminant levels are very high. But in the Bigg's killer whales, contaminants are actually even higher because they're one step higher on the food chain, feeding not just on fish, but on marine mammals who feed on fish. So they carry even higher levels of these contaminants. Again, similar exposure to the same type of chemicals being in the same habitat, yet we're still seeing these different trajectories. And so the fact that we can make this direct comparison, both populations are exposed to vessels, both populations are exposed to contaminants, we can really hone in that the absolute key issue is prey. As we saw with those correlations, abundant prey, abundant whales, declining prey, declining whales. And that's not to say that these other factors aren't important, because they certainly can compound, the effect. If you're thinking of southern resident killer whales, if you're not getting enough to eat, you start metabolizing those toxins you're carrying, and they can affect your immune system and your fertility. And if there's not a lot of food out there to catch, you can, spend a lot more time searching, and that vessel noise might have a greater impact. But as the Bigg's killer whales are showing us, if you do have enough prey, those other issues become more minor and your population can grow and thrive. So what this means, this is just on an individual level, one example comparing two whales of similar age from these two populations. So J31 is a female J-pod born in 1995, and T37A is a female Bigg's killer whale born in 1994. And through there's lots of incredible research that goes on in the area, and some of that includes collecting fecal samples from the whales. And the group that does that can tell from a fecal sample from a whale if they're pregnant or not due to the presence of pregnancy hormones. And so from that research, we know that J31 aborted multiple pregnancies during the beginning of her reproductive years. She was seen with one stillborn calf before she finally successfully had J56, her first viable offspring. Meanwhile, in the Bigg's killer whale population, a whale of similar age had 5 successful births by the age of 25. So again, this is just a specific example showing that when you're getting enough to eat, you're able to help, be healthy and successfully reproduce. Whereas if you're not getting enough to eat, you are getting pregnant, but you're not successfully able to carry these pregnancies to term. And those aborted pregnancies have been directly correlated to the body condition or the health of the mother, which is not too surprising. If you're not getting enough to eat yourself, you're not going to be able to carry a pregnancy to term. And it's, this is just one example of two individuals of how this story plays out. And it's easy to see how one population is growing and one population is struggling. But how about when we look at this across the entire population? We're now in a place where almost every family group of Bigg's killer whales that comes into the area has a whale under the age of 2 in their family. Whereas we're only seeing at most 1 or 2 births to the entire southern resident population over the course of a year. So the Bigg's killer whale population, I should mention, because it's been steadily growing for decades, is much larger than that of the southern residents. We currently have 73 southern resident killer whales. We have about 250 Bigg's killer whales that regularly come into the Salish Sea, but that is part of a coast-wide population that's over 400 whales. So their population is 4 times or more larger. And despite the transient population being so much larger than that of the southern residents, the number of deaths seen over this 8-year time period were pretty similar. But what's really striking is the number of births, where you can see it's much more than 4 times greater. We've just seen this continued baby boom throughout the Bigg's killer whale population. And it was a really striking fact when we realized that there were as many Bigg's killer whale calves born into the population across a 5-year period from 2015 to 2019 as there are southern resident killer whales. So that means there were more than 70 whales born into the population in those 5 years, as opposed to just a small handful of births, less than 15 in the entire southern resident population, and many of those calves unfortunately did not survive. So what can be done? There's been a lot of focus, since the endangered listing of the southern residents in 2005 on recovery of this population, ranging from increased regulations on whale watching vessels to salmon recovery efforts to stormwater runoff. You may have heard of the Governor Inslee's Orca task force a couple years ago that came up with a long list of actions that could be taken at the state level. And unfortunately, where we are now, 15 plus years after the endangered listing, the southern resident population is still declining. And one reason for that, I think, is that we've done a lot of the easier items, things like putting a greater buffer around the whales in terms of vessel approaches is something that can be very immediate and can be implemented very quickly. And so a lot of those actions have been done. But until we really take the major action that's needed for salmon recovery, we're not going to see this population trend reverse. So just briefly, we could do an entire talk just on these 4 items here. But some of these items include dam breaching. You may have heard about breaching the 4 dams on the lower Snake River. And this is because when the southern residents are not here, they roam on the outer coast, and Columbia Snake River salmon make up an important piece of their winter diet. We could implement a fisheries quota where the whales are actually assigned a portion of the fish that are allotted to fishermen each year. Right now, the fisheries quotas are defined based on what salmon returns are expected, and that's divided up among the different fishing groups. But the whales aren't given a so-called seat at that table, where we're not allotting them a portion of whales for their survival. In BC, there's been some great action just in the last year and a half or so about beginning to remove fish farms. This will have a direct impact on the health of those Fraser River Chinook that are so important, because as out-migrating salmon kind of swim through these fish farms, they're introduced to all kinds of diseases and chemicals that they're not normally exposed to, and that's been hugely catastrophic for that population. And then, of course, habitat restoration, especially of the spawning grounds for all salmon species throughout the region, and restoring and protecting those freshwater habitats. And there's some hopeful news in this regard as well. Just this morning in the Washington House, there was a committee hearing about a huge new bill that would promote dramatic riparian area restoration all across the state of Washington. So there's movement on all 4 of these items, but really I think the question at this point is, will we take big enough action soon enough for it to really have a positive impact for the southern residents? But there's always some good news to be found. These whales have shown time and time again that when there is a year where there are more fish, they are able to successfully have calves. And we've seen that several times, including at the end of 2020, when we had 2 healthy calves born to 2 members of J-Pod, who are both those babies are still thriving. And we know, from those monitoring pregnancy hormones and from aerial monitoring of the whales that can determine when they're pregnant, we know these whales are getting pregnant. We know that they're aborting a lot of pregnancies, but we know that when they get enough to eat, they are successfully getting pregnant and they can carry those calves to term. So it's really such an important reminder that if we give them a chance, they're more than ready to do their part and have the healthy offspring that we need for that population to recover. So just to give you, a quick insight into the Orca Behavior Institute, if all of this is interesting to you and you want to learn more, we are always posting up-to-date information based on the encounters that we've had, action alerts that come up when the whales are in the news. You can follow us on any of our social media. And we started really as a science research organization, and we are out there opportunistically collecting behavioral and acoustic data whenever we can. It's really grown since we started in 2015 to include a big education component, which includes, giving talks like this, and advocacy as well. So when these Senate hearings come up, we provide testimony, we provide a lot of written public comment letters in collaboration with other organizations. And we also try to really interpret the science for the general public in a way that's more easily digestible than reading, the primary literature or the journal articles, to really help the general public who cares so deeply about these whales participate in advocating for science-based policies that will truly, have a positive impact for the recovery of the southern residents, the continued health of the Bigg's killer whales, and just the health of the Salish Sea as a whole. So with that, that's what I have prepared for you today, and I'll open it up to questions if you guys have any. And feel free, I don't know, Stephen, if you have a plan for this, if you want people to kind of unmute, or if you want comments in the chat, maybe you can chime in with kind of the best way to handle this here.
I think since there are so many of us, if you all would put, you can place your questions in the chat. That way nobody will be over talking. And it might be easiest that way for Monika to get all of the questions. So feel free to go in that chat and ask questions.
I saw a few hands raised there, so hopefully people are typing their questions in. Just trying to get out of share screen here. Looks like I lost my Zoom for some reason.
Monika, one question from Amber is, what is the data on sex ratio of transient orca calves? Are you seeing more males being born in that population?
Sorry, just trying to fix this here. There we go. Yeah, good question. So one of the issues has been for the southern residents that the calves that they are having, we're seeing a male bias sex ratio, especially in K and L pods. We don't see the same thing in the Bigg's killer whale population. They seem to be successfully having male and female offspring at kind of the expected ratio. So one theory about that is the toxins, where the southern residents are metabolizing more of the toxins, and that's potentially impacting the sex ratio of the offspring. Whereas the Bigg's killer whales they're huge, they're getting tons to eat, and they are not metabolizing those toxins as much. They're carrying them in their blubber, but not metabolizing them. And so we are not seeing that same sex ratio issue among the Bigg's killer whales. Another question I see here in the chat, what's the history of the J, K, and L designations? Great question. So Michael Bigg is, the namesake of Bigg's killer whales. He was a Canadian researcher who determined that you could photo identify individual killer whales. And he started studying whales off the north end of Vancouver Island, where we have a separate population of fish-eating resident killer whales called the northern residents. So northern residents further north, southern residents down here. And he began with designating pods, A pod, B pod, and so on up there, and sort of continued as he went south until he got to J's, K's, and L's down here. And he initially continued that same designation system for the Bigg's killer whales. He continued on with M pod and O pod and W pod, but later determined, that social structure didn't hold up the same way that it does for southern residents. And so as pods were splitting and family groups were breaking off, there was a time, I believe it was in the 90s, they decided to scrap that designation for the Bigg's killer whales and redesignate all of them T for transient, so that A pod, B pod, J pod, K pod still holds up only for resident killer whales, whereas all the Bigg's killer whales are T's now. Another question, if the males stay with mom, are the offspring inbred? Great question. That is one of the main reasons that we see natal dispersal among nearly all animal species, so that there is not inbreeding. But with the southern resident killer whales, despite all resident killer whales where offspring will stay with their mother, they seem to preferentially mate with whales outside of their pod for the most part. This is especially true in the northern resident killer whale population, where their numbers are a little bit larger. They have more pods up there, and they seem to preferentially outbreed with whales outside of their immediate pod. Because the southern resident population is so small, we do see some inbreeding from genetic samples. They've been able to determine paternity as well as the maternal relationships that we observe. And there has been some cases of inbreeding. It's unclear right now what impact, if any, that's having on the population, but with any small population, inbreeding is definitely a concern. And it's one concern for the southern residents for sure. But orcas, wherever you find them throughout the world, they're in fairly small populations. The southern residents extremely so at 73, but most populations are just a few hundred individuals large, which is fairly small in the grand scheme of things. And so it's very possible that orcas have some genetic characteristics that help them deal with inbreeding in a better way than most other species. For instance, they seem to carry more copies of specific genes, which allows them to carry more genetic diversity, within their genetic material. So, like I said, the jury's still out a little bit as to how big of an impact inbreeding might be. Another question here. Do we expect a decrease in harbor seals or other salmon predators due to an increase in transient whales and thus an increase in Chinook salmon to therefore benefit the resident population? Yeah, this is a topic that we discuss a lot because one potential factor contributing to salmon declines among, a whole host of factors such as habitat loss and overfishing are the extremely abundant harbor seals. In some cases, we now have specialists where harbor seals will sit at the estuary, in a river and will just pick off outgoing salmon smolts. And it's definitely a concern in some areas that they're having a real negative impact on local salmon populations. We absolutely think that the rise of the transient killer whales throughout the region is going to help keep that population in check. The surveys and population numbers don't always come out kind of as quickly as we would like. So we don't know for sure if harbor seal populations have begun to decline yet. Although I strongly suspect that they have. We do know that as of even 10 years ago, they were starting to level off. And with the way that the big killer whales have risen in just the last 5 years, I'm sure they're having an even bigger effect on the population. We have a saying, bigs are the balance, meaning that they are really going to play a huge role in balancing out the seal and sea lion populations. There's some efforts and some calls to start culling pinnipeds. So actually doing, human executed kills of seals and sea lions. And we're really advocating to let the big killer whales take care of that issue. For one, they're way more efficient at it than we are. They take a lot of seals very quickly when they are in the area. And I do think that over time, the seal populations will go back to a more reasonable level, and that will be a positive thing for Chinook. Whether that positive effect will be big enough to help the southern residents, we don't really know. I think it will help, but until we address kind of the big human actions that we've taken that have harmed salmon, I don't think that, that alone will help the southern residents. Another question here. Curious more about the northern resident whale population relative to competing with the southern residents. Does your research include this group? We don't directly research the northern residents because we're pretty much focused just right here in the Salish Sea, but it's definitely a factor that we and others consider. A lot of the salmon from the Columbia River, from the Fraser River, when they migrate out to the open ocean, they turn right and they go up to Alaska. And that means when they're coming back to their spawning grounds, they hit the northern resident killer whales in central BC before they reach southern resident killer whale territory here. And it is a real concern that the northern residents, because they get kind of first dibs on those salmon runs, they're doing a bit better. And there's fewer fish for the southern residents by the time the fish get down here. But we know that for many thousands of years, both populations of whales were successfully, living side by side, and that there was enough fish for both populations. So again, I think it's an important factor to consider, but I personally won't go so far as to blame the northern residents for the decline of the southern residents. Really, one of the big issues that needs to be addressed in that regard is the mixed stock fisheries that happen up in Alaska, where for a long time, we were all trained to believe that Alaskan salmon fisheries were extremely sustainable. But a lot of those fisheries, unless they're terminal fisheries kind of occurring at the mouth of a river, are mixed stock, meaning that they catch BC fish, they catch US, lower 48 fish up there in Alaska. And that means that they can have a disproportionate impact on salmon runs outside of Alaska. And so that's one of the big things that needs to be addressed, even as far away as Alaska, to benefit the southern residents, to make sure that there's enough fish coming south for both the northern and southern resident populations. A related question, somebody said, do the northern residents depend on Fraser fish? I don't think their dependence is on the Fraser River to the degree that the southern residents is. They're primarily focusing on fish that return to the rivers in the more northern aspects of their territory, especially the Skeena River in the summer. But because all those fisheries mix out in the open ocean, I have no doubt that they eat Fraser fish, especially out in the winter months when they're on the outer coast, or as they are coming into their summer grounds in Johnstone Strait. They're probably picking off fish that return to the Fraser. Sometimes Fraser fish do return through the inside passage. So they undoubtedly eat Fraser Chinook, but they don't have that same direct dependence on that river as the southern residents do. I think we had time for a couple more questions here. Somebody said, what's your workday like throughout the year? Good question. So started the Orca Behavior Institute as a labor of love. So this was kind of a side passion project for me for our first few years. And I had another job to help pay the bills. But now, as of last year, it was exciting to make the switch that we've grown as a nonprofit enough for me to actually work for the organization. And so that's changed dramatically what my days have looked like, because I can now say yes to a lot of opportunities and a lot of things that I wasn't able to do before, like talks like this. There really is no typical day. We're sort of opportunistically available when the whales are around. So any time of year we try and get out there to view them and collect data. That's sort of still in the peak, is sort of the May through October. But if the whales come through this time of year, we're definitely out there as well. I've really been able to increase the number of educational presentations that we give, and attending workshops and conferences, presenting our work to policymakers and to other scientists and other research groups. We've been really excited to start a couple new programs, educating high school and college students. We offer internships where we mentor students working towards degrees in related fields and provide field research experience. And just this year, we launched a program for high school students, giving them a year-long extracurricular program, exposing them to field research and scientific analysis. So there's been an increasing part of my time sort of spent working with students, which has been really exciting. And then it can range from, working on our analysis and writing up papers to our social media. I spend a lot of time interacting with folks online and making sure that correct and science-based information is getting out there. We put together public comment guides with some of our partners. So it's really wearing a whole wide variety of hats, and every day looks different. Another question here. Do salmon coming out of the Fraser River migrate north and south around Vancouver Island? Yes, they do migrate. They tend to mostly go north, but they will exit to the open ocean, going both north and southwest, kind of out the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I believe in most years, more of the smolts, as they're going out up to the open ocean, will go up the inside passage, which is what puts them past all those fish farms that I mentioned. Whereas when their fish are returning as adults, they tend to come more through the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is why that's always been a major highway for the southern residents as well. So they utilize all those waterways, and it can vary a lot depending on the oceanic conditions, kind of which way they choose to travel. I think we have time for one more question. If somebody has one, I think I got through the ones in the chat here. Does anyone else have one last one to pop in, or should we call that good? I see someone raising their hand. Yes. There. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Go for it, Sam.
How many orcas do you see a day or a year or a month?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes if we're looking at Bigg's killer whales, sometimes we might only see one orca. There might be one traveling all by itself. Other times with Bigg's killer whales, and more typically, we'll see 1 or 2 family groups. So anywhere from like 3 to 10 whales at a time. For the southern residents, they tend to travel in their pods. So we usually see at least 15 to 20 at a time. But when the entire population is together, which does happen, we can see all 73 southern residents at one time, which, as you can imagine, is incredible sight. We do see the entire southern resident population every year, so all 70 or so of those whales. And then for Bigg's killer whales, there's about 250 different individuals that use the Salish Sea throughout the year. So over the course of a year, there's probably 300 to 350 different orcas that come through the area here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
And Monika, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to all of us today. I just am really thankful that you agreed to do this, and I really appreciate it. And for everyone that logged on, thank you for joining us. And we do this every month through May, and then we take a break during the summer, but we'll have our next talk in February for sure. Stay tuned. We'll give more information about that. Okay, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Will a recording be available?